Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of light and secret knowledge wherever you may be, you are listening to Points of Light Radio, the podcast dedicated to taking you past the apron and behind the closed doors of lodges everywhere. And here is your host, Stan Miller.
Greetings, brothers and sisters. Shalom, assalamu alaikum, Adnastana. It's a pleasure to be back with you here on Points of Light Radio and continuing our journey. In this particular segment of Points of Light Radio, I'm bringing you an interview I did a few weeks back with a gentleman named Ian Robertson. Mr. Robertson is a member of the Incorporated Trades of Edinburgh. I really don't have a whole lot of insight to give you on this organization because it's very hard to define, and the best thing would be for him to define that for you. The only thing I can offer you at this point is that the Incorporated Trades of Edinburgh are the trade and craft bodies of the city of Edinburgh, Scotland. They are, of course, headquartered in Scotland. This is a fairly unknown and obscure organization on this side of the Atlantic. I'm sure in Edinburgh, many people know about this. But this will be interesting. I promise you, it will be interesting. What I am going to do is take you straight to the interview itself, so you will, so you get to see. It was quite a lengthy interview and PowerPoint presentation he did, so I'm going to take you straight there. So, without further explanation from me, let's go fellowship with Mr. Robertson. Okay. You got it?
Right. Yep. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Right. Let me... Right. You can hear me and see me okay,
Yeah.
Stan, yeah? Right.
Got
Okay.
it.
I suppose this is a bit kind of self publicity here, but I make no apologies. This is something that I was massively proud of and never ever expected. I became Edinburgh's 350th Deacon Convener.
Okay.
Just to explain that, the Deacon Convener of Edinburgh is the traditionally the third citizen of Edinburgh. So our first citizen is our Lord Provost, similar to the Lord Mayor of London. Second citizen is somebody called the Lord Dean of Guild, or certainly their title. And the third citizen, Deacon Convener of Trades. It's more a ceremonial title today, rather than anything with massive influence. But for me, you know, like even as a Freemason, first Grand Master 1736, and we have provincial Grand Masters that take that role extremely seriously, and rightly so. But for me as a Freemason, I kind of see this as pre-Freemasonry. So to be part of that operative heritage was just astonishing. The other thing for me that was great, in the whole line of the Deacon Conveners going back to 1562, I am the first and only so far deacon, and the term deacon is chair. I know we've got the term deacon in Freemasonry, but a deacon is the chair of a trade, and I was the very first deacon of the Incorporation of Candlemakers ever to hold this position. So that for me is huge. I'll go through a few slides here and I'll explain a little bit more. Just to move on, here are the trades of Edinburgh, but if I can put it into a Scottish context, we have every royal borough had trades. The term incorporation or incorporated was basically the city incorporated them into their fabric and basically gave them the monopoly. So if you were the Deacon of the Masons, I couldn't come in and say, can I just set up my stall here, Stan? You're like, no, you've got to join, you've got to be a member of our incorporation or you cannot work in this city. So it was a massively important and influential status to have, being a deacon and also being part of an incorporation. Across Scotland, every royal borough had incorporated trades. Now, this came in the first Parliament of King James I. He was the first of the Stuart dynasty in Scotland. He'd grown up in England, and it was one of these things where families looked after other family members to keep the politics right. So he'd actually grown up in the English court, and he'd witnessed how the feudal system, which was brought in under William the Conqueror, how the feudal system had affected England. And when he had his very first Parliament, on the 21st of March, 1424, one of the things that he brought in was how we organise the artisans in Scotland, how we organise the crafts. Now, back then, in the medieval feudal period, there were three classes. Those who fight and rule, so that's your royals, your knights, your barons, your dukes. Those who pray, the clergy, and they represent probably about 4% of the population. 96% of the population is everybody else, those who work. Now that includes the peasants, which were the majority, but higher up the social status, you had the merchants and the trades. When we talk about trades today, we don't really think about trades in the correct manner. These people were artisans. They were the people that were building the cities, feeding the cities, or citizens, clothing the citizens, those whole bunch of trades.
So they were the people that made the city run, essentially. They kept the city running.
They were the ones that made it run, and the merchants were the ones who sold the wares. So they were the sort of like business type people, front of shop, but the ones behind the scenes that made it all happen were the artisan classes, the crafts. We pick up on this in Freemasonry through some of these early panegyrics, where we talk about, in biblical terms, like who the first weavers were, who the first artificer in metals was, and this great tradition of how important the craftspeople are. In Scotland, what still exists today are the sort of like main cities that still have these ancient bodies, more in a kind of traditional, historic, civic form than one that makes a big difference. And again, I'll talk you through that. But we have the 14/15 Trades of Edinburgh. I'll clarify that a bit further just in a moment. The 14 Trades of Glasgow, the 9 Trades of Dundee, the 7 Trades of Aberdeen, and the 7 Trades of Irvine that still exist. Irvine's interesting because that's the area in Scotland that includes Kilwinning. So just thought I'd throw that in. How the trades in Edinburgh, being the capital city, were organised under James VI of Scotland. He's the king that also went on to become the king that joined the crowns in 1603 when Queen Elizabeth of England died, and he became the 6th of Scotland, the 1st of England, and then eventually the United Kingdom, where Ireland, Wales were all kind of brought together. Before that happened, when he was the king in Scotland alone, in 1583, he decided, not on historical precedents, but what he decided were the important trades in order. He came up with this list of trades. So number 1 in Edinburgh, and they're different in different areas, but a bit like the London livery companies. You might have heard of the old livery companies. I think it's the original 12 of London, the oldest. But you still have trades where I think it's the tailors and the skinners of London who couldn't agree. So whatever king it was of England at the time decided that they would go 1 year 6, the next year 7. So the expression being at sixes and sevens came from that organising of the trades in London. But anyway, our focus here tonight is the Incorporated Trades of Edinburgh. Number one is the surgeons that went on from being surgeon barbers to becoming the Royal College of Surgeons, which still exists today. And in 1505, King James IV of Scotland, again part of that Stuart dynasty, he gave them the royal status, which is why out of all the trades here, it's the only one with the Scottish saltire and the thistle up to the left-hand top as we look at it. So that's the royal status that surgeons got. Then we move on to the goldsmiths, who were originally part of the hammermen. Now, hammermen was all trades that worked with hammers: blacksmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths, saddlers, pin makers, clockmakers. But the goldsmiths working in precious metals and jewels were set aside and given the status of having their own deacon and their own separate incorporation. Now, to have their own deacon was important in the kind of social status, because to be a deacon of a trade meant that you were involved in the governance of the city, i.e. you became a councillor of the city of Edinburgh. So decisions about the politics and the future of Edinburgh were decided by these deacon councillors, these trade councillors, but also by the merchants. And again, I'll touch on this just after I run through the order here. So we have surgeons, then goldsmiths, skinners and furriers. Skinners are probably more, the term fellmongers or tanners is probably more what people will understand. Furriers, working in ermine and precious furs, so very much something that the royals would acknowledge. We then move next on to the hammerman. Now, in today's language, we would probably refer to the hammerman. Obviously, I've said blacksmiths, etc., but today we would think engineers. Then we have the wrights and masons in that order. We'd probably think construction. These would work very closely together. I mentioned the two St Clair Charters, 1601 where it was wrights and masons, but then the 1628 St Clair Charter to a William St Clair of Roslin, acknowledging him as the patron and protector of the craft. Interesting, brought in the hammermen, the wrights and the masons. We then move on to the tailors, 1505, the incorporation of baxters or bakers, so people that are involved in the preparation and preservation of foods to keep us wholesome and alive. The fleshers or butchers, the cordoners, which is a corruption of a Latin or I think Spanish term, shoemakers basically. Then we have the weavers or websters who would weave cloth. The walkers who worked in felt, hence the reason you've got this felt cap here. And apparently the term walking, they would actually walk the material, to make it subtle and then shape it into using kind of heat to shape those tri-cornered hats that people would wear. Then we have the bonnet makers and dyers. So that's the 14. But the 15th, the trade that I was deacon of, the candle makers, interestingly were a part of the convenery, which is the collective group, between about 1598 and 1604, and then they weren't. And we don't know the reason why, but there was a falling out. So the deacon remained a deacon, but not amongst the collective convenery. That group eventually died out in about 1884, and I was part of the revival in 2009. More on that in a slide or two. The final one here is a society, the Society of Barbers. Originally, the barbers and surgeons were part of the same group, but then over the decades and the centuries, these two professions became miles apart. So in 1722 here in Edinburgh, the barbers wanted separate recognition, but they were not deemed to be high enough in the social status to become an incorporation. So they were made a society. And that's why lots of people have asked the question, what about the brewers? What about the bookbinders? What about the scriveners? They formed parts of societies, but not the higher echelons of the artisan classes and the governance of the city. So I hope that explains that a little bit. Although this is printed in the year 1683, this is a copy of the Act of Set of the City of Edinburgh from 100 years earlier, when James VI created the pecking order that we've just been through. I thought I'd put that in because it's got a nice image of the arms of the City of Edinburgh here. Candle makers, unapologetically, I'll make a little plug here. When I was part of the revival in 2009, one of the proudest things that I've been involved in, when we spoke about why on earth would we reinvent an old organisation, what would be the point in today's world? The original seal of cause or charter presented to the candle makers that still exists here in the city, dated 1517. In 1517, Edinburgh was Christian, the Roman Catholic Christian. The spiritual centre was right in the centre of town, which it still is today, St Giles Cathedral. However, back then, it wasn't like today where you could decide to convert to Islam or become a Buddhist or become a Jew or Hindu or whatever. People were what people were. In the cathedral, pre-Reformation, every trade had a trade altar. So it was dedicated to either the patron or matron saint. And it was very much before the Reformation changed everything. Now, the reason I mention this is I actually think that when the Reformation happened and a lot of the ceremonial aspects were thrown out, there was a bit of a void. So in the Middle Ages, where we had the trade plays, the miracle plays, Corpus Christi, and various things where the trades got involved in these, out in the streets, performing it in the vernacular and not in Latin, famously like the famous York mystery plays. These were happening across the country and across Europe in pre-Reformation times. I think that because something was lost, this may also be an element that begins to arise in the kind of ceremonial that begins to shape itself into what we now know as modern day Freemasonry. Give you one example, it's not a religious one. Everyman was a moral play that was very popular in the Middle Ages. Everyman was about you and me, just ordinary people making our way through life, but being tempted on the one hand and being inspired to live a more divine life on the other. And as an adult, we're kind of taught that you have to leave childish things behind and be responsible for your life. And the medieval thinking was such that whatever decisions you made in life, you would live with in the afterlife. And it could be the difference between eternal damnation or eventually salvation. So it was very, very powerful stuff. In my kind of working theory here, I think that that's brought back into what develops into Freemasonry. Be a good man and true. Be upstanding. Be a pillar of the community. Look after your fellow creatures. Importantly, look after your family first and your work concerns. Be that person that wants to be a better person. So Freemasonry is about making good men better Yeah, I think that these elements go way back such a long time. Now, I've pondered on the candle makers here because our arms, we had the privilege and benefit to reinvent them. Our original arms were pretty much a copy of the Livery Company of London, the tallow chandlers. So we took the element, which was that central shield, 3 doves and 3 white areas. And we were asked, because we were acknowledged, even though we were a revival, we were acknowledged to be part of a much earlier tradition. So having supporters, and I'm not big on heraldry, but apparently supporters are good. Somebody said, would you like supporters? Oh, right, supporters. And a colleague of mine said, Ian, supporters are good. Right, let's have a look at supporters then. Would you like ermine on the white? Ermine, is that good? Ermine's really good. It kind of shows a social status. So we kind of reinvented the arms. And just to explain a little bit here, on the left, as you view the screen, we have Mary Magdalene, because all the trades at one point in time used to meet in the Magdalene Chapel, which still exists, an ancient church here in the Cowgate area of Edinburgh. Got an image that I'll show you just in a short while. On the other side is the Virgin Mary, because the altar that was maintained by the candle makers prior to the Reformation was to Our Lady of Piety, which was an aspect of the Virgin Mary. So we thought, well, that's really nice. We have these 2 female figures both holding candles. It had been suggested that we have 2 candlesticks, but that kind of felt quite impersonal. And although it represents candles and candle makers, we kind of thought it'd be nice if the candles were held by those kind of human values. The Magdalene on the left as well, she's associated with an alabaster jar, symbolically, so that's just to her side. 7 bees, which represent the 7 members that resurrected the Incorporation, but also in Masonic symbolism and other fraternal organisations. It represents industry, it represents people being busy and working hard. So we've got the beehive there as well. And where the original Incorporation of Candle Makers were pretty much tallow chandlers, nowadays we work exclusively in wax. And the thing that I was going to mention earlier about the proudest thing, I suggested that a good purpose for us would be to represent Edinburgh as it is today. Multicultural, not as much as London, but certainly we have different faith groups within the city. So I suggested that we mark the light festivals throughout the year. So, for example, on Sunday, we will be supporting Diwali. And that's been wonderful, just to really get an insight into different cultures, different beliefs, different communities, and actually working with those communities to be part of the bigger community, which is Edinburgh, as I see it. We're all part of one community. And that, for me, feels very fraternal and Masonic, looking out for our fellow creatures, especially in a world today that's really polarised and divided on so many topics. So bringing people together, and light is such a fundamental symbol of that. Up on the candle maker, as I mentioned about the revival of the candle makers, this was actually marking the 500th anniversary of the original charter or seal of cause. And we were delighted that we had the master of the wax chandlers of London and the master of the tallow chandlers of London, who are much older than the Edinburgh candle makers, both come and join us. The top table also included Lion Court, who created our new arms, the Deacon Convener of Trades, sitting next to my wife, Vivian, in the blue there, and the 2 chaps stand up, the Lord Provost and Lady Provost of the time, so like the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayor of Edinburgh. the two gentlemen standing up represent London, and they're toasting the candlemakers of Edinburgh, which was a huge, huge honour that we all felt here in Edinburgh, joining the two cities together. The convening of the Incorporated Trades of Edinburgh came about in 1562, much, long before that. The various trades were given their independent status, autonomous status within Edinburgh. But we found within Edinburgh that there was a bit of a power dynamic between the merchants, who were very powerful, and these individual trades. So they agreed in 1562 to create a deacon of deacons, someone who would bring everybody together. And they would actually have pre-meetings before council meetings to agree on things. So if the majority agreed a decision, then that would be the consensus that would be taken forward to the city and be acted upon. These arms here on the left, it was kind of thought originally that the convenery was established in 1578. So these arms were matriculated in 1978 to mark that anniversary. But we've done so much research since. Our historian, our previous historian, Henry Stewart Fotheringham, really dug deeper, and he took back to 1562, the formation of the convenery. So where some of the trades were dormant, we show them all now, all 15, on the arms of Edinburgh, with the supporters here. First, second and third citizens of Edinburgh, this is when I was installed. We call it a kirking ceremony. So there's an AGM where the business meeting happens and the previous deacon convener hands over. But we also have a church service. So this is the spiritual acknowledgement, if you like, of the citizens of Edinburgh. So in the middle at the time, back in 2018, that's Frank Ross, who was our Lord Provost. So our politician responsible for all the civic matters in Edinburgh. Whenever royals attended, he'd be the first person to be involved. Lord Dean of Guild, an ancient office that goes back to about 1406. And then the new kid on the block in relative terms, 1562, the office of Deacon Convener of Trade. You can certainly see from my smile that that's something that I was absolutely humbled by, and yeah, it still sits with me as one of the greatest achievements I've ever accomplished. Oh, that's just the dates there. Lord Provost, previously Alderman, then Provost, and then the designation Lord Provost was actually given by Charles II to bring the two capital cities, Edinburgh and London, onto an equal footing in terms of their first citizens. I'll share this because it's of interest to your Masonic audience. Seal of Cause. This is a document that stipulated how the trades would work. Now, this particular seal of cause it belongs to the Wrights and Masons. Fascinatingly, in St Giles, in Edinburgh, these two trades worked very, very closely together, the Wrights and the Masons. And that becomes more apparent when I come on to the next document, which is the Grant of Altar. So pre-Reformation, this was actually written out and it acknowledged the patron or matron saints of the various trades. Now, the Wrights and Masons of Edinburgh are completely unique anywhere in Scotland, and I think anywhere else. And it maybe resonates a little bit when we think about the term that we use in Freemasonry, St John's Freemasonry, and we talk about the two Holy St Johns. These dates here, pre-Reformation, are all the kind of key incorporations in Scotland and the dedications that their altars were made out to. Certainly, we've got St. John the Evangelist there, St. Thomas the Martyr, which is very much was the patron of the English Masons. That was the Glasgow Masons, Wrights, Coopers, Slaters, Sawyers, and Quarriers. But the only one where we have the two holy St. Johns, St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, is here in Edinburgh, which maybe gives Mary's Chapel, the Lodge of Edinburgh, number one, maybe a little bit of credence as being one of the early developers of what turned into Freemasonry in parallel with the Incorporated Trade that they sat alongside. Lovely image here of a painting from 1720, the Incorporated Wrights and Masons of Edinburgh in front of Holyrood Palace. The original developments at Holyrood came in the time of King Charles II. He kind of believed that Holyrood Palace looked a bit dowdy compared to many of the European palaces, so he wanted a bit of an upgrade. So if you look at the tower or turret on the left-hand side, that's the original 15th century, but it was one-sided. So he wanted it to be mirrored by a similar tower on the right-hand side, and he wanted the facade to be updated. So what you see, if you ever come to Edinburgh today, and the Holyrood Palace was created by the Masons in the 1680s. However, apparently there was a falling out between the Wrights and Masons, or the other powerful body within that grouping, the Coopers. And it was suggested, shouldn't we be called the Masons and Wrights? Because that kind of follows through. And the Coopers said, hang on a minute, shouldn't it be the Coopers, Masons and Wrights? So they eventually ended up agreeing on the name of their meeting place, which was Mary's Chapel, or St. Mary's Chapel. So they became the United Incorporations of Mary's Chapel. But the reason that the painting here, 1720, is significant, there's a story that they had a bit of an acrimonious split, and they actually split their possessions, including the painting. So this one had to be repainted. And it was repainted by the chap, a guy called Roderick Chalmers, who's sitting in his lovely frock coat there, his velvet frock coat from the 1720s. But everybody else has been recreated in their kind of dowdy garb of the 1680s, a few decades before. I mentioned Magdalen Chapel, where many of the trades used to meet, the hammermen in particular. This still exists today, and above the front door, there are the arms of the hammermen, who were one of the kind of prominent groups that met there. Significance of this building historically is that when the Reformation took place, this was one of the first meeting places of the General Assembly of the newly formed Church of Scotland. But inside the building, it contains the only pre-Reformation Scottish stained glass in situ of any building. And the reason for it is family crests on the window, the family that created this chapel, and not religious devices. The chair that you see here, which sits in this building, is the 18th century chair of the deacon of the Incorporation of Candlemakers. It used to be quite black and dowdy, but looking at records, it was quite a colourful thing back in its day. So a restoration took place about 10, 20 years ago. And one of the fascinating things, like the colours are really bright. If anybody's ever visited Stirling Castle and looked at some of the developments there, the Middle Ages weren't kind of dowdy. They were very colourful. But this being 18th century, there was actually a shipment found on a shipwreck, hermetically sealed. Leather from the 18th century had been preserved, and they actually managed to get parts of this shipment to replace the 18th century leather on the hammerman's chair. The backing's a softer quality. The seat is a harder quality, because obviously that's where someone's going to be sort of spending all the time moving from side to side, especially if it's a difficult meeting. So I think that's wonderful. This modern restoration incorporates leather that still dates back to the 18th century. The big thing that we are most proud of, all of the trades of Edinburgh, is what's referred to as the blue blanket or craftsman's banner of the trades of Scotland, more particularly of Edinburgh. These are two paintings that sit in the Edinburgh City Chambers, the council headquarters, and civic headquarters, that is, because we also have another building. This is supposed to be dating back to the time of James III of Scotland, again part of that Stuart dynasty, where his wife, to the left here, Queen Margaret of Denmark, she and her ladies in waiting recreated this craft banner in acknowledgement of the service that the artisans had given to the king to free him. He'd not been a popular king, he'd fallen out with his nobles, and he was imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle for a number of weeks. But the artisans negotiated his release, and in return, they were gifted with this wonderful new banner, and also something called the Golden Charter, where they could raise their standard, and the monarch, whoever the monarch would be, would give them an audience and listen to what they had to say. The painting alongside is sadly the fortunes of Scotland after what's known as the Battle of Flodden in 1513, where the Scots made an aggressive act against their neighbours down south because they had been aggressive towards the French, and they looked at taking even a mile of land, just as a gesture of, that's not right what you've done. But it backfired. Militarily, it was a tragedy for the Scots, and pretty much every clan family lost people. Edinburgh in particular, we know from the records that the number of craftspeople that did not come back from Flodden was astonishing. And no surprises that trade prices went up at that period in time. So on the on the right here, this is supposed to be Randolph Murray returning with news of battle. And you can see the people that he's coming back to report this to are all the elderly people that have sat in the seats of power whilst the younger men have gone into battle, but sadly now not returned. This has become a great symbol, but also Masonically, the Lodge of Journeyman Masons number 8 in Scotland, who see themselves very much as an operative lodge, they adopted the blue blanket and they still wear it on their ties. This is a version not from 1482, but it's the oldest version that we have in our collection here today. When I say here today, my wife and I actually live in a basement flat and look after this collection. This dates from about the 1640s, and this particular standard with the saltire, so it has royal connections there. This, in probably more recent times, although not that recent, welcomed Queen Victoria to the city in 1886. It also welcomed King George in 1822, Mary Queen of Scots, and a number of others over the centuries. When the fortunes of the trade started to dip, i.e. there was a municipal review in the 1830s, which concluded in 1846, that took away the monopolies from the trades in Scotland. So pretty much you could set up at that point, Stan, as Stan Miller, Master Mason, and you could sort of do building work, whereas previously you needed to be a member of the incorporation. So this is really where free trade opened up. Trade's in decline, Freemasonry on the ascendant. And what we're seeing here is the Freemasons laying the foundation stone of the Grand Lodge in George Street in 1858. But to create that link with the past, they asked if they could carry the blue blanket, the trades banner, the craftsman's banner of all Scotland. And the privilege, in fact, the people that asked were members of Journeyman Masons number 8. So here we see the trades actually handing over to the Freemasons the blue blanket, along there with the Grand Master Mason, and a procession was carried out, and that ceremony of the laying of the foundation stone took place. This was replicated on a number of occasions with number 8 officiating the laying of the foundation stone of the Wallace Monument here in Scotland, one of our kind of top 10 visitor attractions. The laying of the foundation stone of the Loggerate Monument, which was a commemoration to the Duke of Athol, who is still the longest serving Grand Master in the Grand Lodge of Scotland. 22 years he served as Grand Master. And there was a few other occasions as well where the blue blanket was carried by the Lodge of Journeyman Masons. Flodden, I mentioned, these are just some illustrations from the 1860s that kind of go back to what happened marching out to Flodden. People sort of like very upbeat, carrying the blue blanket, but then sadly, news of battle returns to Edinburgh, and you can see the standing elderly gentleman standing in for the Lord Provost with a blue blanket, which, if you look closely, artistic license definitely taken, but the Victorians, in their poetry and in their imagery, they've got blood splattered on the blue blanket because it was supposed to have been laying over the king and acted as his shroud. Because the Freemasons were on the ascendant, there were some discussions happening within the community of trades. Why on earth are these guys taking the spotlight? So in 1886, the blue blanket was very confidently retaken by the convener of trades to welcome Queen Victoria to a grand exhibition that took place here right in the centre of town in that year. So this is a painting of the deacon convener and the deacons of the various trades that we mentioned earlier. Fast forward in time, being part of a revival, not just of the incorporation of hammermen, but these old groups in Edinburgh, they would have lovely meetings in lovely places, but I always thought, who knew? And I thought it was really important that trade should be part of the city and be back out there in the streets. So along with others, we recreated all the trade banners, and every September, there's something called the Riding of the Marches, where riders ride out to mark the boundaries of Edinburgh to make sure they're safe, and then they come back into the centre of town to return the city banner. But leading the way, we have these wonderful banners of the trades and merchants of Edinburgh. And you can just see some of the faces there, proud people carrying these trade banners. It's a very, very colourful occasion. Somebody from the Lion Court, the High Constables, which is another ancient body in Edinburgh, in their top hats and silver batons. And then behind the first, second and third citizens, and behind them again, we have the trade banners. 2013 marked the anniversary of Flodden, which was a remembrance of a terrible occasion, but the blue blanket was involved. So this gentleman here is a past master of the Lodge of Journeyman Masons, number 8, Mark Arnott, past master. This is our new version of the blue blanket, but he was the first member of that lodge to carry this blue blanket in well over 100 years. 2013 was the only occasion when Mark handed over to the captain the blue blanket. He would normally carry the city banner, but the blue blanket took precedence on that commemorative year. So this is the captain back in 2013, riding up the high street with 250 riders behind him, carrying the Craftsman's banner of all Scotland. To mark Flodden as well, we had a gathering of the clan chiefs of Scotland to mark the anniversary in St Giles Cathedral here in Edinburgh. And I had the honour of being the banner bearer on that occasion, marching in front of Lord Provost, Lord Dean of Guild, and the Deacon Convener of Trades. At the back there, you can't see me, but that's not important. What you can see is the blue blanket behind that gathering of the clan chiefs of all the significant clans of Scotland, and their acknowledgement that the part of the part that the blue blanket played on that occasion. And every year we have a gathering like this, where we have the kirking every year of the deacons, and we all process with our banners. And it's something, again, where putting back into the civic life, a bit of colour, a bit of pageantry, a bit of tradition, helping to raise awareness and re-educate people as to where we've come from, but also the significance of the trades today. And I think that's a slide I'll just miss. I'll kind of finish off there and open up if you've got any questions, Stan. I know it's been a bit of a kind of mix of things there, but I hope I've got across, just the significance of the trades to the city and cities of Scotland, and certainly across Europe, but the part that Wrights and Masons played in what eventually evolves into what becomes Freemasonry.
This is interesting. Yes, it was. It's a very deep organization, a lot of history to this, obviously. And but you really enjoy being part of all of this, don't you? You seem to.
Oh, yep. It's surprising me sometimes why more people aren't as interested. Like we are only here because of all that have come before us. So. Good, bad, and indifferent. We do have to own our heritage, we do have to own our past, but we also need to be the custodians now of what we do with it going forwards. And I think that's as true for the trades as it is for Freemasons. I often say, that the mass-produced articles that we've had for probably too long, a lot of people now, they want the bespoke, they want the artisan, they want the quality. So I think there's a resurgence of interest in having master craftsmen and women once again.
And I do agree with that. There is that reaching now, I think, for some of the history and the rituals as well, to bring those back, and that is I believe that is understandable. And it is something I intend to cover further, in other segments of Points of Light Radio.
Brilliant.
Mr. Robertson, I do appreciate your time today, and it's been great. We'll definitely have to have you back, and all the best to you and the Incorporated Trades of Edinburgh.
Thanks very much, Stan. You're most very welcome, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Robertson, brothers and sisters, speaking to you on the Incorporated Trades of Edinburgh. I think the one thing I took from that particular interview was how deep this organization is, how much history there is behind it, and I believe their goals do line up with the goals of Points of Light Radio, which is the preservation in some ways of history, right? But I'm afraid that's all I have time for today, brothers and sisters. But before I go on, I want to remind you that this podcast is available on both YouTube and Spreaker. Please share, like, and subscribe when viewing Points of Light Radio on YouTube. You can follow Points of Light Radio on my Facebook page at facebook.com/Points of Light Radio. My Twitter handle is at PO Light Radio. You can see the link to my Spotify channel, as well as my Points of Light Radio store. Brothers and sisters, been a pleasure fellowshipping with you and my guest today. Until we meet again, just step into the light.